Secret Fire, Chapter 11, Jax. Ethan would have complained about my lack of a plan. He wasn't here, and I only had myself to rely on. All I knew was that the gate had closed, but the red door might be open. I ran under the archway, past the ticket booth and the welcome sign, and grabbed the red door's handle. Locked! I darted to the gate and grabbed the metal bars. There were no pedestrians on the street, but two of Ricardo's men were still standing on the sidewalk. "Help me!" I cried. "Please!" They could hear me. I was only a few yards away, but they ignored me. "He kidnapped me!" I told them. "Help me!" They stood with their hands at their sides and blank looks on their faces, just like those guards at Buckingham Palace who aren't allowed to talk to people or smile or do anything. I tried to shake the gate, but it wouldn't budge either. "What's the matter with you? I've been kidnapped!" Clearly they didn't care. "Kidnapping's against the law," I said, trying to threaten them. "If you don't let me go, you'll get arrested. You'll—" Someone grabbed my shoulder. Instinct took over. I swung around and kicked as hard as I could. It was another man, dressed just like the others. They were beginning to look like clones. He easily avoided my kick. I balled up my fists, ready to punch any of the weak spots, but suddenly my feet left the ground. Another guy had flung me over his shoulder and was carrying me back towards the limo. "Let me go!" I yelled. I really wished I hadn't quit Taekwondo. I only got to the yellow belt, which was the second one. What can I say? I got bored. I didn't know that I'd be kidnapped by a crazy mythological guy. How could I possibly know something like that? That's not the kind of thing that they put in a person's horoscope. "Let me!" I landed on the ground, feet first, like a cat. The limousine driver stepped forward. "Follow me," he said. What could I do? Throw a temper tantrum? Sit on the concrete like a toddler and refuse to let go? There was nowhere to run, and Pyra had disappeared. The driver reached out to grab my arm, but I yanked it away. "Don't touch me," I told him. "I can walk without your any help, thank you very much." I followed the driver through the double doors into a long hallway. The place was cold. Not the dry kind of cold that comes from air conditioning, but as if no sunlight ever made it through the thick cement walls. I tried to memorize my steps, in case I needed to backtrack. I kept watch for fire escapes or windows that might open. Ricardo had mentioned the driver's name. "Timothy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can't you let me go? I won't tell the police. I promise. You won't get into trouble." "Where would you go?" he asked in a monotonous voice. "You are meant to be here. We are all meant to be here." The way he spoke creeped me out, like I was listening to a robot. He was dressed just like everyone else. Ricardo must have gotten a real good deal on blue suits and sunglasses. "Why are we meant to be here?" I asked. "To work for the one purpose." "Okay, creepier by the second." "What is the one purpose?" I asked. "The one purpose is the only purpose." I rolled my eyes. "Oh, gee, thanks. That makes sense. Let's try this again. Timothy, can you define the one purpose? I mean, I know it's the only purpose, but what is it exactly?" He didn't answer. I don't know how he could see with those sunglasses. The overhead lighting was pretty dim. Some of the light bulbs were buzzing. Maybe the wiring was bad and the place would catch on fire. Then the fire department would come and I'd be rescued. I decided to try a different question. "How come Ricardo bought this museum?" "All property is for the one purpose," Timothy said. "And again, what is the one purpose?" "The one purpose is the only purpose." I groaned with frustration. It was like talking to a machine. We walked down the hallway, passing lots of other offices. One of the doors had a sign that read, "Historic Site Research Department," another, "Personnel Office." More people, women and men in blue suits and white shirts, sat at the desks, working on computers. The lights of the computer screens glowed on their faces. No one looked up as we walked by. According to a clock, it was 5 a.m. Why were they working so early? What were they doing? "Hey!" I called, rapping my knuckles on one of the doors. But they continued to stare at the screens, as if in a trance. Were they all victims of Ricardo's urns? We passed a bin filled with museum brochures. I grabbed one and stuffed it in my shirt. Hopefully there'd be a map inside. For someone in a trance, Timothy sure walked fast. We passed a woman. She bowed her head at Timothy. He bowed back. "The one purpose," she said. "The one purpose," he said. I was putting it together like a detective. The urn of faith was definitely at work here. Faith had been stripped from these people, leaving them with nothing or no one to believe in. Then Ricardo had filled that emptiness with himself. He'd become the one purpose, and now they followed his commands, even if it meant kidnapping an innocent girl. And he would probably turn the urn on me. I wasn't sure if I was shivering because it was so cold or because I was really scared. I wrapped my purple jacket as tight as I could. I'd become a follower, just like the other poor victims. I'd start talking about the one purpose. Ricardo was creating his own cult, except it was powered by magic. We were in another hallway. This one had a rounded ceiling. White paint was peeling off the walls. One of the overhead lights flickered. I kept going over the route in my mind so I could backtrack where I escaped. We came to a circular room. The ceiling was made of metal beams, with lots of rusty pipes running across it. More hallways jutted out of the room like spokes on wheels. Each of the hallways had a big number on it. I peered out a narrow window. It was still dark outside, but the first rays of dawn were beginning to appear. Most of the corridors looked empty, but hallway 5 was lined with racks of blue suits and white shirts. Timothy turned and walked down hallway 4. We passed lots of doors. Then he opened one. I looked inside. It was a jail cell. No doubt about it. There was only one tiny window, and it was set too high in the wall to reach. There was a cot with a blanket, a toilet in the corner, and a sink. A loaf of bread, a jug of water, and an apple sat on a little table. You will wait here, Timothy said. Why? I could see my reflection in his glasses. I wondered if his eyes looked like robot eyes. It is the leader's command that you sleep here. Do you not serve the one purpose? If I admitted that I didn't serve the one purpose, would Timothy haul me down to the brainwashing room? It seemed best to pretend. Yes, I serve the one purpose. I bowed. He returned my bow. Then I stepped into the room and Timothy closed the door. His footsteps echoed as he walked away. A terrible feeling welled in my chest, and I couldn't catch my breath. I'd seen Ethan have anxiety attacks, so I knew what was happening. He got them in crowds, but this was the opposite of a crowd. The walls felt like they were closing in. I sat on the cot and gave myself the same advice I always gave Ethan. Breathe slowly. Focus all your thoughts on your breathing. Slowly. Slowly. The feeling will pass. And it did pass. Fear switched to anger. Stupid Ricardo. It occurred to me that at the very moment my father might be sitting on his cot, looking at the walls of his jail cell. He was there because of Ricardo. Well, the villain wasn't going to imprison me too. I remembered his threat. If your cousins do as I have instructed, you will be free to go at 8 a.m. If not, I have other plans for you. He was going to kill me, a mere mortal, or turn me into one of his brainwashed robots, working for the one purpose. No way. Come on, Jax, you can figure this out. I walked around the cell and checked every nook and cranny. There was shampoo, soap, and 2 towels, a roll of toilet paper, and there was the bread. I was starving. The loaf was small but crusty and white. It could be poisoned, but why would he do that? Why would he kill me already? He needed me to make the trade with Ethan and Tyler. It could be drugged to make me fall asleep so he wouldn't be any trouble, but he still needed me for the trade, which was less than 10 hours away. What was I thinking? I knew there'd be no trade. The Urn of Hope had to be returned to Zeus and destroyed, and even if the boys found love, I wouldn't let them give it to Ricardo. I needed to stay alert. I needed fuel. So I took a small nibble of bread, then waited to see what happened. Nothing. I took a larger bite, then waited again. I felt fine, so I ate the entire loaf. I couldn't help myself. I'd never felt so hungry in my life. The room was so cold it went right through my jacket. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders, then sat on the cot and read the brochure. It said that Eastern State was the world's first true penitentiary. It said that the building was designed to inspire penitence. I wasn't totally sure what that meant. Where was Ethan when I needed him? According to the brochure, the cells had held many of America's most notorious criminals, including bank robber Slick Willie Sutton and Scarface Al Capone. Whoever wrote the brochure described the prison as a haunting world of crumbling cell blocks and surprisingly eerie beauty. Beauty? I said with a snort. The haunting part was probably true. There was even a special ghost tour you could take to visit the haunted cells. Obviously, this brochure had been written before Ricardo bought the place. That's why the sign on the sidewalk had said closed for repairs. Ricardo didn't want tourists walking through his lair. I looked around nervously. Then I turned to the back page and found a map. I retraced my steps from the main entrance and the offices we'd passed, then to the circular room, which was called the surveillance hub. There was a dining hall, a basketball court, and a movie theater. There was a death row and a famous escape tunnel, but it had been filled in a long time ago, so it wouldn't do me any good. The entire prison was surrounded by the stone wall. The only exit appeared to be the gateway we'd driven through. This was totally different from the prison where my dad was being held, a minimum security facility known as the prison camp. The inmates hadn't committed violent crimes, mostly financial crimes, so they wore nice clothes, got hot meals, had a library, access to email. Email? I pushed the blanket aside and began to pace, trying to work my thoughts into something. Anything. The window was too high to reach. The door was my only way out. Maybe I could break the lock like they always do in movies, but I didn't have a bobby pin or anything sharp. I crouched in front of the door and examined the lock. It looked like the kind that a long key would fit into. I grabbed the knob. Maybe if I pushed hard enough, the door opened. Whoa! How was that possible? I'd assumed that Timothy had locked me in, but this whole time it hadn't been locked. Then again, why would he lock the door? If I served the one purpose, there was no reason to think I'd want to escape. Timothy had treated me as if I were just another brainwashed zombie. That had been his big fat mistake. Oh, I had one purpose, but it wasn't about helping Ricardo. I was going to go back to those offices and use one of those computers. Chapter 12. Ethan. Fact. One of the first things you practice in social skills class is eye contact, even though it's very uncomfortable for many people. It's one of the most forms of nonverbal communication. Too little makes the person feel like you're not paying attention. Too much, however, can be aggressive and make the other person uncomfortable. Avoiding eye contact in a crowd maintains your individual privacy, which is what I tend to do. My teacher likes to say that eye contact is important because eyes are the window to the soul. If that is true, then Pandora's soul was beautiful. Welcome to my home, she told us, her eyes twinkling. I couldn't look away. It wasn't because I'd suddenly lost my shyness and had a sudden urge of social confidence. It was because her eyes were mesmerizing. They were almond shaped, and they changed colors, literally, from blue to green to violet and black back to blue. It was distracting. She opened her front door and let us into her house. I wasn't sure what to expect, since I'd never been to a god's house before. Technically, Pandora wasn't a god, but she lived with them, which made her immortal. I expected she'd have a mansion or a castle, but the house was small and simple, like a cottage. The stone walls and marble floors were white and perfectly polished. The wooden furniture was sparse but elegant. One wall was covered with a dolphin mural built from colorful mosaic tiles. Another wall had a life-size mural of an olive tree. The whole place was clean with absolutely no clutter. No stacks of books or piles of junk mail. No shoes lying around, no coats draped across benches. It was a house without stuff. My mom always complains we have too much stuff, and that if she could go back to the hours she's get back the hours she spent putting away stuff, she'd be young again. She'd like this house. As Pandora walked us through the various rooms, I got a better view of her. Her red hair hung all the way to her waist, and it sparkled like her daughter's. Her white gown was sleeveless, and the belt was woven from golden thread. Her skin was very brown, which seemed unusual for a redhead. I wanted to point out that an excessive amount of tanning wasn't healthy, but then again, if you're immortal, you probably don't have to worry about skin cancer. Her feet were bare. I guess she didn't have to worry about stubbing her toes either. I'm wondering about something, I said. Why did you tell us we were safe in your house? I mean, is this house magical or something? How can it keep Zeus from finding us? There is no magic in my home, she said. Only the gods have magic. But Zeus knows he is not welcome here. Thus, he never visits. Pandora stopped walking and gestured at a wall that was covered in smaller mosaics. These are portraits of my daughter, she explained. The first showed a baby with a happy grin. The others caught important moments like first tooth, first steps. It reminded me of the upstairs hallway in our house where Mom displayed our school photos, even the ones with braces and embarrassing haircuts. I wondered if Pyra was embarrassed by any of these pictures. I miss her, Pandora said. There was so much sadness in her voice, I suddenly felt sad too. She's okay, I told her, even though I wasn't sure that was true. Hey, I was wondering. Tyler pushed his messy hair from his eyes. Is this guy Pyra's boyfriend? He pointed to a mosaic that showed a teenage Pyra standing with a young man. He had his arm around her. That is not Pyra, Pandora corrected. That is myself and my husband when we were first married. Pyra does not have a boyfriend. A goofy smile spread across Tyler's face. He'd been acting weird ever since he'd met Pyra in the parking lot outside Merlin's Comics. He'd been flirting with her nonstop. I knew exactly what he was thinking. He was imagining that when all this was over, he'd ask Pyra on a date. I was about to point out that from what I'd heard, long distance relationships were very difficult to maintain, even if two people lived in the same dimension, and even if they were both mortals. The odds seemed stacked against Tyler, but something else caught my attention. It was a mosaic of two young men. Both had black hair, and one was clearly older than the other, taller, with more muscles. He stood with his hands on his hips, smiling proudly, as if a spotlight were shining on him. The younger man stood quietly to the side, watching. Pandora stepped next to me. This is my husband and his brother, Prometheus, she said. Prometheus? Tyler gasped. Whoa, that's what he looks like? This mosaic was created a very long time ago, Pandora told us, but he was once a handsome young man, as was my husband. She pointed to the younger man, the one standing off to the side. Please understand that Epimetheus was a kind soul once, gentle, compassionate. The man you met named Ricardo is not the man he used to be. What happened? I asked. Pandora sighed. His heart was broken. By a girl? Tyler asked. No. Pandora's eyes settled to a muted gray. Then she gazed into the distance, as if she could see the story she was about to tell. When he was young, Epimetheus spent most of his time with his brother, Prometheus. This was when we lived in your world. Prometheus was fond of humans, and he had many friends among them. One day he decided to give them a gift. Fire, Tyler said with a knowing smile. Pandora nodded. The gift of fire gave man creative power. It changed the balance of things, and this made Zeus angry. In retaliation, Zeus declared that Prometheus would live out eternity chained to a rock. During the day, an eagle ate his liver. During the night, the liver healed so it could be eaten again and again. I'd heard the story, but that's all it had been, a gross, impossible story. But as I watched the tension on Pandora's face, I realized the story was true. Pandora continued. Epimetheus grieved for his brother. He pleaded with Zeus to offer mercy. He petitioned the Mount Olympus Council, but Zeus's ruling stood. Epimetheus could not free his brother, but he was determined to help him. So he visited his brother every day, bringing him water laced with poppy to make the pain bearable. When Zeus heard of this compassion, he ordered Epimetheus to cease. But Epimetheus continued, so Zeus created a magical barricade so that no one could pass. Without the poppy water, Prometheus suffered day after endless day. Epimetheus could do nothing. He began to hate Zeus, and that hatred grew with each sunrise until it became a ferocious, unyielding beast. I would hate Zeus too if he tortured my brother, I thought. When I married Epimetheus, he tried to hide the fact that he hated Zeus. He tried to live within Zeus's laws, and he fooled most of us into believing that he'd forgiven Zeus. But Zeus was still angry with both brothers for their disobedience, so he decided to punish them yet again. Oh, that's where the wedding present comes in, Tyler said. Pandora's box. I mean, your box. Pandora didn't seem to mind that Tyler kept interrupting her. I didn't dare say a word. Her story filled my head with all sorts of images, and I tried to imagine Ricardo as a person who had once been caring and nice, who'd loved his brother. Then I felt a flash of hope. Maybe there was still some kindness inside him. Maybe he wouldn't hurt Jax after all. To punish my husband for his disobedience, Zeus gave us a wedding present, Pandora explained. A lovely box, but we were told to never open it. That's like when our parents put gifts under the Christmas tree and tell us not to open them until Christmas morning. Tyler frowned. I always hate that, so I always open a few, because how can you resist? Like you, Tyler, I could not resist. Her voice had lost all of its musical qualities. It was clearly a memory that still brought pain. She touched her temple as if a headache might be starting. I was young and curious. I wanted to know what was inside. And that's when evil was unleashed, I said quietly. Yes, she sighed. Zeus told everyone that I had unleashed evil into the world. The moment turned awkward. What could you say after that? Unleashing evil was a pretty bad thing to do. It wasn't like she opened the box and a mouse got out, or a plague of locusts. It was evil. Tyler's stomach growled. Where are my manners? She said with a graceful wave of her arm. This way, please. We followed Pandora into a dining room where a long wooden table was covered with platters of food. Almonds and salty olives, loaves of crusty bread, cheese curds speckled with herbs and roasted meat. Pandora washed her hands in a bowl of water, then dried them on a linen towel. Tyler and I did likewise. The water was warm with flower petals floating in it. Pandora sat in one of the chairs, then she motioned for us to sit. Tyler threw himself into a chair. Do we have time for this? I asked. What about Jackson Pyra? I am just as concerned as you are about your cousin and my daughter, Pandora said, but there are details we still need to discuss. Besides, heroes cannot undertake quests on empty stomachs. You got that right, Tyler said. Is that what we were? Heroes? I had more questions, but at that moment my stomach felt as hollow as a gourd. I needed to eat. So I sat next to my brother. After setting the leather bag on the table, and removing my baseball cap, I looked around for a napkin, but there wasn't one, and instead of a plate, there was just a small serrated knife. Those look good, Tyler said, reaching out and stabbing a fig with his knife. He plucked the fig off the end of the blade and ate it. He then grabbed a whole roasted chicken, tore one of its legs, and bit into the crispy skin. Pandora didn't cringe at Tyler's manners. It appeared that eating without a fork or plate was acceptable. I tasted one of the figs, then the bread and cheese curds. The flavors burst in my mouth. I tried not to talk with my mouth full, but I couldn't help it. This is so good! Pandora sat quietly, drinking from a silver cup and watching us with curious interest. I felt self-conscious all of a sudden. She was observing me, a human, a mortal. Did we look weird to her because our hair didn't sparkle, or because our eyes didn't change color? Are you thirsty? She asked. She presented us each with a small bowl. Tyler cupped it with his hands and gulped the contents. I wasn't so sure about drinking the stuff. The liquid was metallic, like melted gold. What is this? I asked. Ambrosia, she said. Seriously? Tyler laughed. I'm drinking ambrosia. I took a small sip. It was thick, like honey diluted with water, but it tasted like something I'd never known. Just incredibly delicious. Tyler started taking pictures with his phone. Then he leaned sideways and took a selfie with Pandora. She didn't seem interested in the technology. That's when I realized I hadn't seen any televisions or computers in the house. No machinery either. I suppose if you live in a world with magic, you don't need technology. When we get home, this is going to be my screensaver, Tyler said. Home. That word brought me back to reality. It was so easy to get distracted by the beauty of this place. I set down my bowl and looked at Pandora. You said there are more details we needed to discuss. Yes. She set aside her drink. What conditions has my husband set for your cousin's release? Tyler wiped his mouth on his sleeve. Epimetheus wants all three urns. He has the urn of faith already. But he wants us to deliver hope and love to him by tomorrow morning, or we'll never see Jax again. Those urns, she said, her voice quieting to a hiss. How I curse those urns! What really happened? I asked. I mean, we know the story we read in books, but what made your husband leave this place? Why is he trying to take over our world? She scooted to the edge of her chair and folded her hands on the table. Whatever she was about to tell us, it was important. During our marriage, Epimetheus's hatred for Zeus continued to grow. But he had one thing that brought him joy, and that was our daughter, Pyra. He adored her. Her hugs comforted him. Her laughter warmed our home. I thought that her love would heal him. But one day, Zeus sent the urns. Tyler and I leaned closer to catch every word. Zeus told the world that the urns were a symbol of his magnificent power. They were for Pyra, and no one else was allowed to open them, or they would be ruined. The urns sat on a mantle of Indy's house, and each day my husband would stare at them, his hatred raging. He wanted to destroy something that was important to Zeus. So he opened all three urns, and as they emptied, so too did my husband's heart empty. Zeus knew he'd open the urns, Tyler said. It was revenge, right? Pandora nodded. Zeus had inflicted another punishment upon the brothers. Epimetheus would live a life without hope, love, or faith. Zeus was finally satisfied. His revenge ended, and he allowed Hercules to free Prometheus. But my husband could not be freed. He was forever changed. His heart was broken. It was a sad story. To think that the man we'd been afraid of, the man who was back home terrifying people, had himself been a victim of a vengeful god. That's a terrible thing to do to someone, I said. Zeus is cruel. That he is, a voice bellowed. Startled, we all turned in our seats. A large man stood beneath the archway. He glistened with sweat, as if he'd walked a long distance. He was bare-chested, wearing a sort of kilt and a leather apron. He carried a giant hammer. Why did you summon me? He snarled at Pandora. You know I have work to do. I summoned you because I need you, she replied with a patient smile. Then she rose to her feet and motioned in Tyler's and my direction. Tyler Hatch and Ethan Hatch, I am pleased to introduce you to Hephaestus, son of Zeus. A clunking sound filled the air. I whipped around. Tyler was lying on the floor. Chapter 13, Jax. Clutching the map, I stepped cautiously out of the cell. I half expected to hear the ghosts of prisoners past, clanging their metal cups against the bars, or dragging chairs as they paced their cells, but it was quiet in the hallway. No signs of anyone walking around, no ghosts or brainwashed followers. If I was going to pull this off, I needed to look like a member of the cult, dedicated to the one purpose. So I hurried to hallway 5. The suits were hung neatly, in order of size. I grabbed the smallest pants, suit coat, and shirt I could find, then slipped into a room. I dressed quickly. The suit didn't fit perfectly, but it would work. I rolled up the pant hems so they wouldn't drag, and tucked in the shirt. Once the suit coat was buttoned, I felt like a bank teller. Hello, how may I help you today? Would you like to make a deposit? Perhaps you'd like to deposit your brain for the one purpose. There was a bin in the center of the room filled with discarded clothes. jeans, sweatshirts, tennis shoes, regular stuff that Ricardo's followers had worn before being brainwashed. There was more evidence of their past lives: umbrellas, purses, and hats. One of the umbrellas had a name written on its handle: Dagmar Watson. How had Dagmar gotten stuck in this mess? Did her family wonder where she was? Did she have children? I felt so sad looking at the pile of clothing. Each item represented freedom taken away. I didn't add my clothes to the bin because no one was going to take my freedom. I hated leaving my purple jacket behind because it had always been my good luck jacket. And if there was one thing I could use, it was good luck. I slid my wallet into the back pocket of the blue pantsuit, along with my house key. Then I folded my jeans, shirt, and jacket and tucked them behind a radiator. One of the walls was lined with shoe boxes, each containing a pair of black dress shoes. I decided to keep my sneakers since I might need to run. Besides, those dress shoes made loud clicking sounds, and I needed to be as quiet as possible. I read the brochure map again, then I stepped into the hallway and nearly bumped into a woman with short black hair. The one purpose, she said with a bow. The one purpose, I said with my best robotic voice. I also bowed. She walked away. No questions about what I was doing or who I was. She didn't seem to notice my shoes or the nervous sweat on my forehead. I sighed with relief. As long as I looked and acted like one of the cult, no one would question me. I had to stay confident, had to act like I belonged. I hurried to the hall with the offices. They were still filled with people sitting at computers, but one office had a single desk, and the man sitting at it was old and bald. His eyes were bloodshot, as if he'd been sitting up all night working. I tiptoed and stood behind him. There was a basket of wallets on the left side of the desk. He'd opened one of the wallets and had spread the contents on the right side. The driver's license photo was of an elderly woman with the name Dagmar Watson, the umbrella owner. The man was reading an email from AAA Mortgage Company to the new Mount Olympus Corporation. Subject: Dagmar Watson Property. We have received the notarized documents. Ownership of the property listed at 822 Village Circle Drive has been transferred to the new Mount Olympus Corporation. I glanced at the pile. The address on Dagmar's driver's license was 822 Village Circle Drive. That's what Ricardo was doing. After brainwashing his victims, he made them turn over all their possessions. Other than robbing banks, he was robbing individuals. Pure evil genius. But why was he calling his corporation the New Mount Olympus? Did this have something to do with Mount Olympus, the home of the gods? Of course. He wanted to erase Zeus and become the new god, and this world would become the new Olympus. I gasped, and when I did, the man turned around. I bowed. The one purpose, I said. The one purpose, he said. Uh, how could I get rid of him? I needed the computer. I thought about it for a moment. Ricardo said it's my turn to sit here. For the one purpose. He stood immediately. I live to serve the command. He bowed again, then walked down the hall. Wow, talk about easy peasy. Luckily, I didn't have to type in a password because the man had left the screen open. I plopped onto the chair. The wood was warm. I didn't know how long it would be before the man returned, so I had to act quickly. I selected Compose, and a new email screen appeared. Ethan and Tyler knew that I was at the Eastern State Penitentiary. They knew that the exchange would take place by 8 a.m. But if they were unsuccessful, if Ricardo turned the urn of faith on them, then no one would know what happened to us. I had to tell someone. My mom knew nothing about the urns, and so she wasn't a good choice. And Great Aunt Juniper had suffered a stroke, so she didn't need the extra stress. But there was one person who knew all about Great Aunt Juniper's secrets and the magical urns, and what we'd been up to. My father. When I visited the Brookville Federal Prison Camp, he'd given me his email address, and I tucked it into my wallet for safekeeping. From Jax Malone to Isaac Romero. Subject: Ricardo. I paused. Were Brookville prison emails private, or did they get read by the warden? Maybe it didn't matter either way. If the warden read this email, he'd probably think the sender was crazy, and he'd probably ignore the whole thing. I typed as fast as I could, not worried about typos. Ricardo kidnapped me. I'm at East State Penn Museum. He has faith. He wants Ethan and Tyler to bring love and hope. 8 a.m. tomorrow. I will try to escape, but he might use faith against me. If that happens, tell Mom the truth. I don't want her to think I joined Ricardo. Tell her I love her. Should I have told Isaac that I loved him too? He was my father, but I didn't know him. I hadn't even known that he was alive until last month. I looked around for a phone. There was a landline sitting on the corner of the desk. That meant I couldn't send a text to Tyler, but I could call him. I picked up the receiver. Then I dialed Tyler's number. It didn't ring. Instead, a recorded voice said, "Unauthorized call. Please enter your security code followed by the pound sign." I quickly hung up. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Drat! I'd been caught. I returned to the previous screen showing the email from the AAA mortgage company. Then I scooted out of the chair and was ready to bow and act innocent. Jax? Pyra stopped in the doorway. She was still wearing her blue tunic and sandals. I've been looking everywhere for you. What are you doing in here? She glanced at my clothes and her face turned pale. Oh no! Did he? She put a hand to her mouth. Jax? Did he? It's still me, I said. Her hand dropped to her side. Oh, thank the gods! I am so very sorry about all this, Jax. But how did you? Never mind. She looked up and down the hallway. My father is distracted. His mind is infected with hubris. I don't know what that means, I said with a frown. Hubris is excessive self confidence. It infects his mind like an illness. It is a terrible curse. He believes himself unstoppable. However, she glanced over her shoulder, then whispered at me, this hubris makes him vulnerable, and that is our advantage. So are you telling me that you're still trying to help stop him? I asked. You're still on our side? Yes, of course. My quest has not changed. The urns must be destroyed, but I am determined to save my father at the same time. She grabbed my arm. Come with me. She pulled me into the hall. Where are we going? We weren't walking toward the front gate. I imagined myself busting through the red door, or calmly telling the guards to let me out because Ricardo had ordered me to get him a latte at the nearest Starbucks. For the one purpose. Father sent me to get you. We're supposed to wait in the auditorium for the ceremony. What ceremony? He has invited dignitaries from all over the city to take part in a grand reopening ceremony for the museum. What? I yanked my arm from her grip. No way, I said. I'm not going to some super boring ceremony. I'm getting out of here. But you don't understand. Oh, I understand. I understand everything. Your father isn't just taking control of people's minds, Pyra. He's taking all their belongings, their bank accounts, their houses. He's using the urns to make himself super rich. He wants to be the most powerful man in the world. In my realm, magic brings power, she said. Well, here, money is power, and he's getting a lot of it. I have to find my cousins. If they do show up, I have to get them before Ricardo does. I have a better plan.